How's it going, my friend? It is Danny here from foxohealth.com, and in this three-part series I'm going to talk about the power of autophagy, something that we may be able to use to help keep us young and healthy. In this video, part one, I'll talk about what autophagy actually is. In part two, I'll talk about three key pathways that drive autophagy, and in part three, I'll talk about some different ways those pathways can be triggered. So before I get started, quick disclaimer, don't take this as medical advice or any kind of advice. It's for information and entertainment purposes only, and if you choose to use any of the material in this video, you do so at your own risk. My suggestion is always do plenty of research and always seek medical advice from a professional. Okay, so let's jump into part one. What is autophagy? So to best answer that, I'm going to first talk about aging. So as we go through life, our bodies, or more specifically our cells, will undergo stress. And some of this stress can unfortunately cause damage. So things like free radicals produced when we eat and breathe can damage our cells. Carcinogens from the environment can damage our cells. And even our own immune system, if we have chronic inflammation, can damage our cells. Now, over time, this damage to our cells, or what's inside our cells, i.e. the cell components, can accumulate and contribute to cell aging. And this can actually lead to our cells performing at suboptimal levels or even becoming dysfunctional. And both of these could eventually lead to disease. So you could argue that the accumulation of this damage to our cells over time is a key contributor to the biological aging process. But what if, as we went through life, there was a way to clear out some of the damaged cell components and replace them with healthy components and potentially slow down the aging process? Well, it turns out there may be a way we can do that, and that is where autophagy comes in. So autophagy is where damaged or aging components of a cell are sequestered and then literally eaten. This not only clears out some of the damage, but also creates energy to build new young cell components. Now, the word autophagy is actually Greek for self-eating, and we all have the power to induce this process whenever we want to. How do we do it? Well, there are several ways, but the most well-known way is through fasting. Now, what's worth mentioning at this point is there isn't really an on-off switch for autophagy. It seems there's always some amount going on in the body due to a cell's normal process and housekeeping. But we can increase autophagy by doing certain things, and fasting is one of them. So during my explanations, I'll say things like autophagy is triggered or activated, but I'm really saying we're turning up the dial or even inducing different kinds of autophagy. Now, before I talk about the process of autophagy and what actually happens during this self-eating, I want to explain the difference between autophagy and something similar called apoptosis. Now, in some ways they're alike, but they are different processes. Apoptosis is about programmed cell death. If a cell gets in such a bad way that it's likely to cause serious trouble, the apoptosis process is a means to kill it before that happens. It's like a self-destruct trigger. Autophagy, in the majority of cases, doesn't kill the cell, but rather eats up damaged portions of the cell. So autophagy is about self-eating, apoptosis is about self-killing. Now, to help me remember these two pathways, I created two characters, both heroes, as they're both here to keep us healthy and make our lives better. So for autophagy, I created the autophagy aardvark, and this is the image I used to remember his association to autophagy. So you can see him there eating up the damaged cell components. I also decided that he loves toffee, so I've named him Toffee the autophagy aardvark. For apoptosis, I created the Apoptosis Assassin. Now, he's a program killer. His job is to kill the damaged cells that are too far gone, so I imagine his gun popping as he's taking his shots. Now, by no means is a perfect representation, because in reality the cell kills itself, but it's a fun way to remember. Now, Toffee and the Apoptosis Assassin, they do have a grudging respect for each other, but most of the time they'll work separately. You rarely see them working in the same cell, and they kind of want the glory for themselves, so sometimes you'll see them block each other. Now, that being said, they're not mutually exclusive, and sometimes, like Batman and Superman, they'll team up and you'll see both self-eating and self-killing in the same cell. Now, that's rarer, but it happens because they're both activated by some of the same upstream pathways. Okay, so now that I've introduced Toffee, the autophagy aardvark, I'm going to use him to describe the process of autophagy in 4 steps. And obviously we don't really have an inner space aardvark floating around in our cells. I'm just using him as a fun way to describe this. So step 1 of autophagy. Toffee will make his way through the cytoplasm of the cell, and the cytoplasm is a bit between the nucleus and the cell wall, the watery bit. As he travels through, he's licking up damaged cell components and he's sequestering them inside his mouth. Now, those components can include mitochondria, ribosomes, bacteria, viruses, and others as well. Now, the mouth of toffee has a special name. It's called the autophagosome. And in reality, it's this autophagosome that is traveling through the cytoplasm and sequestering these damaged organelles. So that is step 1 of autophagy. Step 2 happens after toffee has crammed all he can into his mouth. Once he has, he closes it. Now he's fully sequestered those damaged organelles from the rest of the cell. And again, in reality, it's the autophagosome that has closed and sequestered those cells. So that is step 2. For step 3, toffee's stomach, called the lysosome, will fuse with his mouth, called the autophagosome, forming a new structure called the autophagolysosome, where those organelles are now contained. So lysosome, stomach, autophagosome, mouth, put them together and you have the autophagolysosome. So that is step 3. And for step 4, those damaged organelles are degraded and recycled to allow for their rebuilding. So that is a process of autophagy in 4 steps. And what I've just described is a process of macroautophagy. It's a kind of autophagy you can see with an electron microscope. Now there are other kinds of autophagy like microautophagy or chaperone-mediated autophagy, but they're less well studied, so let's just stick with macroautophagy for this explanation. Now let's talk about some of the key high-level drivers of autophagy. Now you can think of autophagy as either being driven by supply or demand. Now let's talk about demand first of all. So in the case of demand, that's where we see general nutrient deprivation causing a stressful environment to our cells. There is a demand for energy because there is no food, so the cells are forced to eat portions of themselves to create the energy. So that is known as autophagy by demand. Now let's talk about autophagy by supply. So in that case, we see a damaged or aging organelle within a cell actually change the composition of its surface, so it's decorated with signals inviting the autophagosome, the mouth, to consume it. So there isn't necessarily a demand for energy, but the supply is there in terms of the organelle offering itself up. Now when that happens, the autophagy becomes specific to certain types of organelles. So for example, we have mitophagy for mitochondria, we have ribophagy for ribosomes, we have virophagy for viruses, and so on and so forth. And that is known as selective autophagy. Now, the great thing about the damaged organelles giving signals to be eaten is that when a cell does actually undergo general stress through, let's say, nutrient deprivation, and that demand for autophagy kicks in, autophagy will actually target the damaged organelles first. So the organelles are being consumed in an order of priority, and the damaged ones go first. Okay, so that is basically it for part 1 of the series. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll do a quick recap and then we'll call it a day. So autophagy is where a cell component will be sequestered, eaten, and then replaced with a fresh one. And that's important because as we go through life, the stresses of everyday living will damage our cells and our cell components. Now, autophagy is not to be confused with apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. And it's rare to see both autophagy and apoptosis occur in the same cell, but it can happen. The process of autophagy is as follows. The autophagosome, which is like the mouth, will travel through the cytoplasm of the cell, sequestering damaged organelles along the way. And the lysosome, which is like the stomach, will then fuse with the autophagosome, the mouth, forming the autophagolysosome, where those damaged organelles are contained. And those organelles are then degraded and recycled to allow for their rebuilding. And that process is called macroautophagy. So autophagy can be driven by demand or supply. Autophagy by demand occurs in response to a stressor, like nutrient deprivation. And autophagy by supply occurs when we have a damaged organelle giving off signals to be consumed. And remember, there's always some amount of autophagy going on in the body due to a cell's normal function, but we can increase autophagy or even activate different kinds of autophagy by doing certain things, and fasting is one of them. Okay, so that's it for part 1 of the series. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, hit the like button, and if you'd like to see more videos like this one, hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to follow my series of short written articles, you can find me on Instagram at FoxoHealth, and of course be sure to tune in for part 2 of the autophagy series, which will be out very soon, where I'll talk about 3 key pathways that drive autophagy, and I'll be introducing some new autophagy heroes, including Thor mTOR, the Kinase King, and Coe Commandos. So until then, please take care.